And good morning. Well, I want to start by taking you back, and I want to take you back to 1999. Because in 1999, in the room of a London hotel, a group of people had gathered for a very pleasant lunch, and that group consisted of the owners and managers of what were then most of the leading UK development studios. And the lunch was hosted by a very fine firm of corporate financiers, and I think I'd been added on to make up the numbers. And amongst the general chat about what was happening in the games industry, the thesis that was being promulgated by the corporate finance hosts was, well guys, you're all doing really well, but this is a good time to take some of your money off the table. You're playing with your own chips, take some of your money off the table, take some investment, think about an exit, because this is the time to do it. I don't remember everyone who was at that lunch. It was a very good lunch. But around my end of the table, I can think of 4 companies represented. And looking back, of those 4 companies, none took that advice. Since then, one is still going strong, has successfully transitioned from a console work-for-hire developer to mobile free-to-play publisher. One achieved not a great exit about 6 years later, and 2 have gone bust. So it's quite a sobering thought actually when you think back to that sort of dinner, lunch, and who was there and their fortunes and how they've differed since then. Because at the time, those 4 companies, you couldn't really have told them apart or differentiate them in any material way. Similar size of business, similar numbers of people, similar revenues, similar quality of clients, and yet very different outcomes many years later. So the proposition that I'm speaking to today, it sounds a bit like a weather forecast really, because this historic M&A cycle will be cresting from early 2016 into 2017. And as with weather forecasts, my timing isn't exact, but you get the general flavour of what I'll be speaking to. Before telling you why I think that might happen, first a brief look back to 2015. At the macro level, 2015 was a stunning year for M&A transactions. There was nearly $5 trillion of M&A transactions, 69 deals over $10 billion, 10 transactions over $50 billion. I am of course not talking about the games industry, I'm talking about the macro industries worldwide. So I've included brewing, pharmaceuticals, other bits of technology, but overall it was a big year for M&A. So within that context, what happened in the games industry? The answer is not that much. Now, the figures I've picked up here from our friends at DigiCapital would suggest it was a pretty lean year for M&A. According to their numbers, the total deal value, which includes both M&A and IPOs, investments, was less than $5 billion. And that, if true, would represent a fall of 81% on 2014, and for M&A, 75% down on 2014. Now, as I said, I haven't tried to verify those numbers. They surprise me, but I'm a simple lawyer, so I've just picked them up from people who do these things for a living. They surprise me, but they suit my proposition because I'm coming from a really low base. The other thing about those figures is it doesn't include Activision and King, because technically that doesn't close until 2016, which again suits my proposition really well because I've already banked $6 billion. And you'll have read the rumours about Ubisoft, and maybe I'll bank another mega deal before I've even started. So I'm feeling confident about my thesis already. So what am I going to talk about? First of all, what are the key drivers? Why do I think that this may happen? Second is, if it's going to happen, what are the buyers looking for? If you're a seller, how can you take advantage of this wave that is apparently coming? And then finally, since I want to hedge my bets and I'm a cautious lawyer, why this might not happen. So first of all, what are the key drivers? Why is this change coming? I think there are a number. First of all, there are a lot of companies that have huge amounts of cash. Now, of course, we all think of Chinese companies in this regard, and it's true they have astounding amounts of cash. It's also true of other Asian companies. But it's true of other big companies as well. For example, one could almost mentally have written off Zynga, but they are sitting on a lot of cash, and they've recently made an acquisition, of course. So big companies generally are throwing off huge amounts of cash. And of course that's a great thing for them, gives plenty of opportunity, but also it's a challenge because if you've got lots of cash, you've got to do something with it. Interest rates at a record low level. If you're sitting on piles of cash, it's going to take not too long before your investors and shareholders are saying, look, board, what are you doing with all that cash? And if you're not going to use it, why don't you give it back to us? So companies have a lot of cash and they want to deploy that cash. The second is there's undoubtedly an increasing amount of interest amongst Asian businesses in coming to Europe in particular. They're already in the US to a larger degree. They will do this in different ways depending on the business. Some will just set up greenfield offices. Others will do investments, but I'm sure that there'll be quite a lot of M&A driven by Asian companies coming to Europe. The third is console companies are entering the market. Now, of course, most notably, that's recently been highlighted by Activision's near finalized acquisition of King. But you could also look at Nintendo and DNA. And there are other console businesses that are slowly waking up to the fact that there is a world outside of shiny discs, and they're not really in it in any material way yet, and will want to do something about that, I think. The fourth is there are other companies not already in the business that will want to be entering the business. Now, I think of a company like Amazon, already in it to a degree, of course, but clearly has big ambitions, generally, and games will be no exception, because it's recently just put out the CryEngine as part of that strategy, and I could well see Amazon making acquisitions in this space. And that's even before you go on to the sort of the wider media and entertainment businesses, where there's been just an increasing realization, and it's taken a while, that the games industry is a meaningful industry and one in which they may want to be in. The fifth is, I think there's a really good crop of great businesses out there, independent at the moment. I was almost tempted to start naming a few, but that would be unfair and I'd miss them out and all the rest of it. But you don't have to work very hard to guess who they are. Even within the UK, there's just some brilliant businesses. I put between $10 and $250 million. That will be the sort of notional exit value, if you like, of an acquisition of those sorts of companies. So I think there's a number of sort of good fruit on the tree that's sort of waiting to be picked, if you like. The sixth is, of course, we have new technologies and markets coming along. A lot of Casual Connect has been about VR and esports, and rightly so. Social gaming as well. And that always throws up M&A activity. Because what happens, of course, is you have a lot of new companies will start in those different areas. We've heard the figure over 300 investments in VR. Esports, has come from almost nowhere and is on clearly a very, very sort of steep trajectory in terms of revenue growth. And around that, you'll have the big players in the market who will not yet be in this space at all, or not in any meaningful way. And the time will come where they will say, you know what, we've got to get in that space. And it's probably too late for us to sort of do a sort of building from ground level. We need to acquire something. We need a solution now. You could see it in a way in Facebook's decision to buy Oculus, to missed out in a sense on mobile, didn't want to miss out on VR, we'll buy Oculus. And you can look at similar sort of things that have happened already, but I think there'll be a lot more of that. And companies in those spaces, I think, are set for some interesting times. I've had gaming on there. It's been a real challenge, I think, for the games industry to get its mind around gaming, by which I mean betting, gambling. But there's, I think, an increasing amount of interest there and the opportunities that presents. I think the seventh, and it's a very obvious one, is that if you're a smaller player, you just face an increasingly high and hard number of challenges. The cost of development, production, increasing cost of UA, the sheer proliferation of content, 150 games a day hitting the App Store, and generally dealing with platforms becoming a lot more difficult, I think. So I think there's a recognition amongst smaller players that life is getting tougher, particularly if you're in the sort of mobile games space. But also, there's challenges for big players. They've got to use their cash. They've got to achieve growth in revenue and margin, and they need to keep up with competitors. If you are one of Activision's competitors looking at the King deal, you think, what does that mean for us? What are we going to do? So you see your competitors doing something, and there's a need to sort of wake up and do something about it. So I think there's lots of reasons why there'll be an increasing amount of M&A activity. If that's right, then what do I think buyers are looking for? Well, some very obvious things. Revenue, clearly, revenue and margin if you're a big player. That's particularly true on the sort of the higher deal size transactions that will come along. Content, I think if you speak to any big player, they're always on the hunt for good IP. And they may see a game and think, that's a great game. It's achieved a level of success. But if that game were within our machine and our cross-promotional tools and our UA spend, there's a good chance we could take that game from down there. Might just make the top 25. Probably maybe not the top 10, but if we make the top 25, that would be a really great return. So good IP is always going to be of interest, clearly. I've added people. I think that's probably less true now than it was a few years ago. In the early days of the second wave of mobile, if you like, something or 2007, 2008, 2009 even, there were probably a relatively small number of people who really knew the dark arts of user acquisition and all the rest of it, monetization. I think that knowledge base has become bigger, but at that time, people would undoubtedly pay a premium to get the right people, and you had a number of sort of acqui-hire type transactions. I think that's less true now. However, I think it could be true in some of the other areas I've mentioned, such as VR, esports, gaming. But it is still a factor. People, still want good people. I think locations on some of the sort of maybe the mid-sized players who are looking to expand geographically and are looking to get a new base in, whether it be London or Berlin or Barcelona or wherever, rather than starting from a greenfield site, acquiring an office, particularly with good people, good management teams that don't need sort of too much looking after from a distance. I think that kind of thing is also of interest. I say technology. Generally, I would say no, but there are undoubtedly some specific bits of technology that will be of interest to some people. I was talking to someone yesterday. They were very interested in some of the sort of the back-end engineering skills that they were finding really hard to even to find outsourced people to do, and so looking outside the games industry for those sorts of technology skills. There's also a sense of, well, what's a competitor looking for? And amongst all the science and Excel charts that these sorts of exercises generate, there's always a bit of, well, if they're interested in that, so maybe we should be interested in that as well. And once it's like herd instinct, once someone shows an interest in a company, then you'll suddenly find there's 2 or 3 other people who show an interest in that company, sometimes for no more logical reasons than their competitors' interested in that company. That's when it gets sort of slightly less analytical, a little bit more emotional. So, third thing, if all that's right, how do you try and position for best advantage? Obvious point, but if you're a smaller player, I'd say think strategically. On one of the panels yesterday, I think it was Chris Lee on the Super Angel panel, he was reiterating the need for people just to be able to step away from their business even for a short time and just think, hang on a minute, why are we doing this? Or what are we trying to do? What's the bigger picture? Away from the sort of day-to-day decisions on game design, game production, cash flow. What are we trying to do here? Where are we going? You've just got to sort of step back and think, what are we trying to achieve here? And I think maybe you can't be something that you're not, but there may sometimes be opportunities to take your business in a slightly different direction. For example, I think of a company like Pitbull Studios, a UK developer, that took a very sort of strategic decision that they were going to follow the style of Unreal Engine, and in effect became Epic's UK solution, if it like, for developing tools and technologies. Ultimately, it led to being acquired by Epic. So they sort of took that decision to differentiate themselves and tie their sort of fortunes to that of Unreal. And I think that sort of worked for them. There have been a few other companies I've seen who've made a very definite play for VR and said we are going to be a VR studio. Whether they're too early on that, time will tell. However, for a couple of them, it's enabled them to get investment because they've kind of got a story to tell. They've made a conscious decision to go in a particular direction, and it may be right or may be wrong, but they're doing something about their own future. They've sort of, as best as they can, taken destiny in their own hands. On the back of that, they've got a story to tell to investors or buyers. I would say get advice and input, and I don't mean necessarily for any formal advice, but just talk to people. And I think Casual Connect's great for this kind of thing. I sat in most of the day yesterday. I think there were some terrific insights from panelists and speakers. If you go and speak to corp devs, and we had a number of them yesterday, they will generally tell you what's of interest to them, or certainly what's not of interest to them. And they will say, well, look, we've got something in that genre. We're not interested in that. We don't like puzzle games. We don't want word games. We're looking for free-to-play console. We're not looking for free-to-play. No, they will tell you that. They want to try to sift the number of opportunities that come their way, or make more relevant the ones that come their way, and they will share quite a lot of information with you if you just speak to them. Speak to intermediaries, lawyers, accountants, corporate financiers who know this business. Dan Bernstein's following me. He's going to drill into the detail of going about preparing for an exit. Talk to someone like him. They'll give you some insights on what people are looking for and what people aren't looking for, and what may or may not work for you. Obvious point, however, in the desire to seek an exit, just keep focused on your business, otherwise the whole thing will go horribly wrong. The best way to get a good exit is to have a great business, so don't lose sight of that. And within that, once you've got your strategic direction, then keep that end game in mind. So that will surround decisions such as who we're going to take money from. If we take money from this strategic partner, then it's going to close off these doors. If we raise money from this venture fund, then they're going to want to achieve a level of return that will close off other doors. It may open others, but you just need to know what you're doing. And within your commercial deals, then some very obvious points. I've got license terms, contractual provisions. There's some obvious things around, change of control, rights of first refusal. All these things are going to cause a problem on an exit if you don't get that right. And then be ready for when the time comes to execute a deal. And there's a lot of sort of housekeeping that you can get right. And I think Dan will help you sort of think about those sorts of issues. And I think finally on that, I would say be realistic. The fact is, it's probably a buyer's market right now. There are a lot of big companies with a lot of cash, but I think there's an awful lot of companies, particularly smaller ones, who, when I've gone through the problems they face, they will say, yeah, I know all that. I can recognise I've got an issue. If someone comes along, then I'll be interested. Well, I think you need to also be realistic on price. So, having said all that, why might I be wrong? So I've already bagged, I think, one, maybe two mega deals already, so I'm feeling confident. But why might not this happen? Well, the first is macro issues. We could have another third world war, all that sort of stuff. The force majeure, you can forgive me if that get wrong for that reason. Second is China. Now, I could have bundled that with macro issues, but I think China's worth calling out specifically because so much of the cash is currently sort of in China or would come from China. So if there are issues in the Chinese market that affect the companies there, then it could have a significant impact on my forecast, if you like. The Chinese government, as someone said, I think yesterday, the Chinese government will probably help the real estate market. They probably won't be bothered about helping the games market as much. Subscale businesses. There's a lot of companies out there who I think are probably too small to take advantage of this. The kind of businesses that companies want to buy are probably a bit bigger than where these guys are. There's a lot of time, effort, cost involved in any M&A transaction, so it's got to be worth everyone's while. And unless a business has sort of achieved a certain level of scale in terms of revenues, particularly, then it may not even get onto the sort of the discussion table. I think of some of the companies that I alluded to at the start of being great businesses, a few of them are what you might call lifestyle businesses. They're doing really well. They're making lots of cash. The guys there are doing the kind of thing they want, able to develop the games they want, and they're just not interested in exit. And what's wrong with that? Well, probably absolutely nothing, I would say. If it's their business, if they're happy, they're making money, well, that's great. Get on with it. Just be aware that things can change, and the value you have now may not be there forever. But that's fine. They'll carry on making a lot of cash, and why bother with an exit? And I think the whole sort of free-to-play economics means that there are some companies that may never have more than one IP, and the life of the company will just be generating, extending, exploiting that IP, but eventually it will come to an end. I was talking to a business a few years ago, not in the game space. It was a property portal business and was generating huge amounts of cash off the back of sort of aggregating properties for sale. And I was talking to the CEO about what their strategy was, and he said, basically, we're just going to hand back as much cash as possible to shareholders because this business is going to end. The estate agent is going to wake up the fact that we're doing all of this and they should be doing this. They won't partner with us. They will do it themselves. In the meantime, we're making fantastic revenues. We're going to hand back the cash, and when it all ends, we'll just hand the keys back to the landlord and we'll be done. There's no exit here. There's just a cash generation business, and for some, I think it's almost like that. I think the really big challenge is what I call a valuation gap. There are a number of deals that could have happened, but I think some of the sellers had what I would call unrealistic expectations. I think only now are people waking up to the fact that it is probably a buyer's market. You can, to a degree, bridge unrealistic expectations with tools like an earn-out, of course. They have their challenges, but you can bridge that gap to an extent. But the second gap that is more difficult to bridge, I think, is investor expectations. And if people have come in as seed investors in A round, and they will have said to themselves, we'd either want to see a return of this or more, or actually we've sort of written off the money. But really a deal that just gets us back our money, it just doesn't work for us, because we'd sooner this business just tries again and tries to get the ball out the park type hit, rather than just an exit that achieves our money back. And there's a few businesses I see that have that kind of investor base, and I think they'll be very difficult to achieve an exit unless things change and the investors say, okay, we'll call it a day, we'll take our money back or a bit more, and we'll call it quits at that. So going back to the dining room in 1999, I think that the message I've taken away from that is it is incredible how long it can take to build value and how quick it can be to lose it. So I think if you're an owner-manager and you've got the opportunity to do an exit and take some cash, I would say think very, very hard before saying no. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, really, really good talk. So you mentioned VR. I just would like a little more of your insight on that. You seem to have a pretty good grasp on this stuff. It's unprecedented, right? I personally don't know what to expect in terms of sales or revenue for over the next couple of years. I mean, what's the investment view on that? I mean, is it a good time to put your money there, or should you really just wait?
Well, I think I mentioned there's been over 300 investments in VR. So obviously a lot of people have thought it's a good time to put some money in. Jürgen Goldner, I spoke on VR yesterday, and he made an interesting point, which was the forecasts have probably got it wrong in two ways. That is, it's going to be smaller than we think initially, but much bigger than we think eventually. So the general view, and I'd agree with this, it's a long burn. Of those 300 investments, clearly only a minority will ultimately prove to have been successful, but of those minority could be stunningly successful. So I'm bullish about VR. I'm probably less bullish about VR in games than I am about VR generally, to be honest. In terms of this sheer scale of opportunity, games has an important role to play with early adopters, etc., etc. But it's beyond games where its true impact will ultimately be felt.
You mentioned the other two sectors that you mentioned were esports and gambling, and you don't. I guess what do you see emerging there? I mean, is there investment opportunity in those spaces, and are there small players in that? Especially, it seems like esports is a bit of an all or nothing proposition right now.
Yeah, I think there are some really interesting opportunities there. It was fascinating hearing the guy from Wargaming talking about esports, I think, on the first day, and he said, the first time they really woke up to it was when sponsors were contacting them saying, can we sponsor your esports tournament in Asia? And they said, well, we don't have an esports tournament in Asia. It wasn't them, it was someone else who was doing a World of Tanks tournament. And there are people doing interesting stuff there, which I think ultimately it's very investable and very acquirable. Gaming has always been a difficult one because of the regulatory issues, which have sort of scared people away. But a few companies have made a conscious effort to get into it, and I think have done a good job. So I saw just the other day that Plumbee had sold to a Sony company, I think. Plumbee, a UK developer, made a very conscious strategic decision. We're going to be in gaming. They had, on the back of that, got an investment from Endemol, and ultimately now a successful exit. Of course, they made the decision at that time when King was going the other direction, but that's by the by. So I think people are beginning to get more comfortable with sort of the regulatory issues. And the other thing about it is, while it takes a while to get your mind around it, it provides useful barriers to entry in the way that pure social gaming doesn't. Because of regulatory issues, US investors have tended to stay away from the space, but I think there's an increasing interest in it.
I was with GameSys for a couple of years, and
of course, yeah.
So definitely was close to a lot of that, and there were some interesting developments, I think, in the U.S. I mean, we sat there kind of waiting for more states to open up legalized gambling, but I think what perhaps was more interesting was some of the laws now to allow skill-based elements in gambling games. Have you seen any of that? You start to see a crossover. I don't know if have you seen anybody emerging in that space, or is that still too early?
It's a little early. I mean, there's people trying to. I mean, Zynga, I think, have made some strides in it. And of course, even if you look at the sort of the top 10 grossing free-to-play games, there's quite a strong gaming theme that you have there. So it's not a big flip for people to do.
Any more questions? Are we done? Okay, I guess we're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.